Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ted Ruger, the Dean of the Law School. It's good to see friends, alumni, distinguished guests, and we've got a wonderful speaker here tonight who will be more properly introduced by a colleague. And this lecture, which is this first time this lecture has occurred since COVID, like so many things this fall, is to celebrate the remarkable work and legacy of Judge Arlin Adams. And I'll turn more to that in a moment to put the judge's tremendous career and legacy in context. But I want to also welcome and celebrate the presence of the judge's widow, Mrs. Nessa Crystal Adams, who has endowed the fund that supports this lecture and enables us to get into some of the most critical issues of law, history, First Amendment, as well as celebrating the judge's legacy. So thank you, Mrs. Adams. Nessa embodies a lifetime of devotion to Penn. She herself is a graduate of Penn's College of Women in 1942 with a BA in biochemistry. Foreshadowing our current trend, there are more science students than ever coming to law school, about 25% of our student body, and has served in many capacities at Penn as an overseer of the School of Social Work and class officer, and has done so much for Penn, continues to be involved with the law school, and helps us both honor her late husband as well as bring tremendous scholars here from other institutions to share their wisdom. So thank you, Nessa. I'd now like to turn a few more words to Judge Arlin Adams himself. He was an extraordinary jurist, leader, and legal mind. He was a towering figure in this community and nationally for many decades. His career took him from Schneider Harrison and Siegel and Lewis here in Philadelphia to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, to positions as a mediator on complex issues involving corruption and bankruptcy. He graduated from this law school in 1947 and remained committed to this institution throughout his life. He was elected here as a student, as editor-in-chief of the Law Review. He then went to clerk for the Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, Howard Stern, and was offered a teaching position at Penn Law, as well as an associate position at Schneider Harrison. Unlike many of us, he chose to actually impact the law as a lawyer rather than the ivory tower, although he came back and has supported and inspired us in the following years. And he had a tremendous career in private practice. Just a week removed from Veterans Day, it's also notable that Judge Adams served in the military, in the North Pacific as a U.S. naval officer in World War II, and then had a career of public service. President Richard Nixon appointed him to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, where he served for 17 years. He was deeply involved here as president of our Board of Advisors, akin to our Board of Trustees at the law school, and is the namesake of the Arlin Adams Professorship in Constitutional Law, held by my colleague, Professor Sally Gordon, who will join the podium in a minute. And again, it's a great pleasure both to bring a tremendous scholar, Mary Bilder, to share her thoughts today and also honor the judge's legacy and be with members of the judge's family and Nessa Adams. So thank you. Some of you are watching both here and virtually for CLE credit, continuing legal education, which I think the judge would have approved of. And so it's my obligation to say these passcodes so we know you were really listening and taking the class. So the passcode is dawn, although my directions say dawn twice. So the word dawn, like it's a new dawn, D-A-W-N, and I'm told to say dawn. So that's something that we may get, so try that for the first password, and then I'll have more. I'll be back later with the second password, but I'm going to turn it over much more substantively to my colleague, Sally Gordon, who in turn will introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you, Sally.
I'm glad I know the first password anyway. It is lovely to be here this afternoon and to welcome Professor Bilder and especially to celebrate Judge Adams, whose life and career were full of legal learning and dedicated, as I learned as his clerk. There's another Adams clerk here, Peter Marvin, today. Dedicated to thoughtful and generous understanding of the Constitution and those who worked so hard to construct what might be a viable and maybe even eventually just government for a new country. And I just want to mention one story that the judge, which is what we called him, the judge, used to love telling the story of his search for a job as he reached the end of his law school career, because the dean bought him a suit so he could get a job. And he said that left him ever grateful to Penn and its law school. And so it's especially lovely to have a lecture in honor of someone so loyal and so wonderful. I can imagine his delight at this lecture, and I know he would be fascinated by Professor Bilder's work. Mary Sarah Bilder is Founders Professor of Law and Professor of History at Boston College. She earned her JD and PhD in history from Harvard, and she clerked for Judge Francis Murnahan of the Fourth Circuit. Not the third, but good, right? She has taught at BC for 28 years. Actually, that's exactly the same length of my tenure at Penn. Neither of us moved. What a happy thought. Professor Bilder is a great teacher whose specialty in teaching in law school is one that I also treasure, property, as well as constitutional history and legal history. She has won lots of prizes for her fine teaching and her brilliant scholarship. I have read all three of her books: The Transatlantic Constitution, published in 2004, Madison's Hand in 2015, and the book we'll hear about in just a few minutes, Female Genius, published earlier this year. She has been awarded with a Bancroft Prize. That's a really, really big deal where I come from, as well as 4 other book prizes and countless awards. She's also a valued member of the community of legal historians, who was key to the publication of the essays of Kitty Pryor, a beloved mentor of 2 generations of early career scholars. And she was also key to a program set up to recognize fine new talent with an annual event named after Kitty Pryor that has become a mainstay of our legal history conference. In other words, Mary Sarah Bilder is good people, really good people, in addition to her spectacular talent as a scholar. We are in for a treat this afternoon. So my only job now is to get out of the way so we can all learn about female genius. Thank you for being here.
So I'm going to put this on so that everyone can hear me, even if it looks a little goofy. I have a pretty big voice, but hopefully this makes my voice even a little bit louder. So I want to thank the Dean and Sally Gordon, Professor Sally Gordon. I see some friends, Karen Tani and Serena Maori in the back there, who are wonderful friends on this faculty. And thanks to Dory Pavel for just amazing assistance. And I'm so grateful to have this opportunity because of Nessa Adams and the Adams family's sponsorship of this lecture in honor of Judge Arlin Adams. And I'm delighted that, let me see if I can get this to, there we go. I'm delighted that Mrs. Adams's and Adams's family is with us tonight. And because the lecture says law and religion, I thought I should begin somewhere a little bit different than my book. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my book on Eliza Harriot Behrens O'Connor. I always begin these lectures about my book with Eliza Harriot's own words, and you see them here on the slide. The exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved upon by future candidates for literary fame. Eliza Harriot believed in the power of the example, of the influence one person had to present an example that would inspire others and future generations. And this idea was the theory on which she understood her extraordinary lecturing and female schools. And in hearing about Nessa Adams and Judge Adams, I'm struck by how much they have also embodied this belief in the power of the individual example. And I think that Eliza Harriot's example that I'm going to talk about tonight, and the Adamses' example, particularly in their commitment to education and in supporting countless unnamed young students to imagine a future for themselves in which they could fully participate in American life. Now, at the outset, let me explain that I have a picture book approach to slides, and because I'm kind of a restless listener, and I always like to know where the speaker is, I have 21 slides. When we think about the framing of the Constitution, we tend to think about that event in the way that public art depicts the moment. So the classic images of the framers, you see them up here, the very famous ones from the House of Representatives and the National Archives, depict the founding moment as about the men inside the room. No one's part of the story except the white male delegates. And Thomas Jefferson described these group as an assembly of demigods. And to be sure, there are no demigoddesses in these pictures. But Clio, the muse of history, was a demigoddess. She was the child of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the titan of memory. And Clio's provided inspiration for prominent female artists like Angelica Kauffman, some of the first women to become members of male art associations. And she was therefore the name of our puppy that you see on this slide. And Clio reminds us that history creates power by selecting what we remember about the past. And I believe we misremember the space around the framing of the Constitution. Now, this project's part of a larger argument I've made about how we think about this period. As opposed to founders or framers, I like to think about it as a framing generation, because I believe many people outside of that room in Independence Hall influenced the way in which the 1787 Constitution was drafted. So last year, for example, I published a piece about 4 Native Nation representatives who traveled to Philadelphia during the Constitution and shook hands with George Washington, and how that helps us see the ways in which the Constitution presumed First Nation sovereignty. And in a similar vein, I'm working on a little piece thinking about the origins of the No Religious Test Clause. And because of the title of this series, I thought I would begin briefly there. Now, the Constitution was unusual in 1787 in having an explicit clause that stated, no religious test shall ever be required as qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And similarly, 3 times in the Constitution, it states that government officials do not have to take an oath, they can instead affirm. Indeed, the Constitution even spells this out in the presidential oath in a little parenthetical, I do solemnly swear, or affirm, and then you go on to be the president. Now, at the time, British laws used test acts to bar a broad group of dissenting Protestants, Jews, Unitarians, Catholics, and Muslims from holding office. And many state constitutions had similar requirements. And so against this backdrop, the Constitution reflected an extraordinary statement about a national government liberated from the requirement of prescribed religious beliefs. Now, who do we give credit to? Well, the conventional story tells us it was because of Charles Pinckney of South Carolina. After the convention adjourned, Pinckney actually claimed credit for the Test Act. And he later said he even introduced it in May, a claim that has been proven incorrect by historians. But Pinckney is an awkward path breaker. He, along with his cousin C.C. Pinckney, were outspoken at the convention in their insistence that the Constitution protect slavery. And he held hundreds of people in enslavement. And there's actually little in his biography to suggest any deep commitment to religious liberty. And indeed, Pinckney did not introduce this idea out of thin air. Philadelphians were in the midst of a fight over their own state constitution's religious tests. And outside of the convention, various people opposed the Test Acts. Indeed, in early August 1787, while the convention was meeting, the Philadelphia newspapers reprinted at length debates in the House of Commons about repealing the Test Acts. That repeal would fail in England until 1828, but delegates in Philadelphia read about the great British orators emphasizing that a government of liberty should not have religious restrictions. One man in particular cared about the Constitution not having religious restrictions, but he was not allowed to be in the room in Philadelphia. This was Jonas Phillips. He cared so passionately about the right to serve in government office and to practice one's religion that he wrote to the convention. He wrote to the convention and to George Washington, as he put it, as one of the people called Jews of the city of Philadelphia. And he signed his letter with the date of the Hebrew calendar in addition to September 7th. He wrote that he objected to the clause in the Pennsylvania Constitution that prevented Jews from holding public office, and he believed it was in conflict with the state's promise of freedom of conscience. And quoting that language, he argued to the convention that they should omit any oath that referred to the New Testament as divine inspiration so that all religious societies, as he put it, would be on equal footing. George Washington had that letter retained as part of the official papers of the convention. Indeed, it's one of the only private letters the convention retained. And although Phillips waited until September to put his concerns formally in writing, one suspects it reflected earlier conversations. And so this backstory about wider conversations about the illiberal nature of the religious test clause likely explains the unanimous convention vote in favor of the bar. And so we can ask, who is actually responsible for the fact that the Constitution insists on the right of all people, regardless of religious faith, to participate in national government? Do we credit one man who tried to claim credit, Charles Pinckney, or do we restore the influence of the many voices outside the room? Someone like Jonas Phillips, who advocated that those inside the room create a world that allowed those currently excluded to participate. So turning now to the, hopefully, to the subject of my book, let me take another clause, this one relating to the sex of the president. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull ran for president, the first woman to do so. But since then, only men have been elected. And eventually, if I live long enough, I'll give this talk and I won't have to say that, okay? But there are 28 male pronouns relating to the president. And somebody might think that that means that women were excluded intentionally, or that the framers could not imagine the possibility of inclusion. But in 1788, Hugh Henry Brackenridge read the Constitution as open to females. His essay mocked the criticisms of the Constitution. He began, "The first thing that strikes a diligent observer is the want of precaution with respect to the sex of the president. Is it provided that he shall be of a male gender? What should we think if in the process of time we should come to have an old woman at the head of our affairs?" He asked, what security have we that it be a white man? His views on both possibilities are ambiguous, but Brackenridge revealed the Constitution's semantic gender tolerance. Now, for me, this question about female inclusion arose over an entry in George Washington's diary of May 1787. Washington was waiting at the convention, for the convention to start. He'd been at tea at Robert Morris's house. And then he went with Robert Morris's wife, Mary White Morris, and other ladies to hear a lady read at the college hall. He later explained the reading had been a charity affair because the lady, being reduced in circumstance, had recourse to this expedient to obtain a little money. He judged her performance tolerable. which is for us Pride and Prejudice fans, what Mr. Darcy says of Eliza Bennet the first time he meets her. And so I actually think it was kind of a relative success. And this lady lecturer was Elizabeth Harriot Barons O'Connor. And I will call her Eliza Harriot because that's what she called herself. That was the part of her name that was her own. She's been largely unknown. There are only 5 extant letters. And so this project was based considerably on newspaper research, particularly recent digital newspaper research. And my book reveals Eliza Harriot's incredible importance to women's rights and her belief that women would reach the college and the political forum. I believe her lectures influenced the Constitution's gender-neutral language, and her efforts at female academies influenced countless women in the new nation. Now, we have no portrait of Eliza Harriot, but perhaps she resembled her cousin, Catherine Hardy, who you see in this lovely Thomas Lawrence portrait. Eliza Harriot was born in Lisbon, and she grew up in England, a member of the aspiring gentry, educated at an elite boarding school. Her mother's grandfather and uncles, both Sir Charles Hardy, were admirals, and her uncles served as governors of New York and New Jersey. Her father served as the port collector in Boston and the postmaster in Charleston. In 1776, she married John O'Connor, an Irish law student at London's Inner Temple. He appeared to be a gentleman, albeit impoverished, with unverified hints of connections to the ancient Irish royal families. John was educated during a period when the penal laws that had oppressed the Irish Catholics were slowly being relaxed. And their mixed religious marriage speaks to their own belief in the trajectory of political reform. After John became a barrister in Dublin, they returned to London in the early 1780s, and there Eliza Harriot's father died, leaving her the modest income from a trust, free of her husband's control. Now, they came of age in the 1770s and 1780s, what I call the age of the Constitution. Constitution here referred to the system of government, not a particular piece of paper yet. That would come later. And people were rethinking assumptions about who should participate in the state. For some women, reform raised the possibility of altering an intellectual tradition that had embraced female inferiority. As far back as Aristotle, the Western tradition had insisted on an ideology of female inferiority. Influential educational theorist Rousseau, for example, explained, the whole education of women ought to be relative to men. Reader, I appeal to yourself, be sincere. Which would you esteem the most? A woman whom you found employed in the proper occupations of her sex, in her domestic concerns, or a female genius, scribbling verses on her toilette and surrounded with pamphlets of all sorts? And thus a radical idea rose in the English-speaking world, female genius, which signified that women had equal capacity, deserved equal education and political representation. Recognition of female genius in this period, to show just a few examples, included the famous painting by Richard Samuel of the 9 Muses of Britain, showing contemporary female geniuses as proof that Britain was entering a new golden age. It included the recognition of African-American poet Phyllis Wheatley as a female genius on her trip to London. In London, female debating societies debated female representation with the arguments placed in the paper. And Catherine Macaulay, the great English historian, embodied the connection between female genius to political inclusion when she was painted showing herself wearing the Roman senatorial staff. Now, in 1786, with the war over, Eliza Harriot and John moved to New York, the capital of the United States. the beginning of an 8-year journey finding her lecturing and opening academies throughout the United States. She began and ended her career in Columbia's. In New York, her first female school gave extraordinary public exams at Columbia College with the participation of the Columbia professors. And she wrote that up in the newspapers for all to see. Ironically, her last school would be in another Columbia, South Carolina. Now, although Eliza Harriot was extremely successful in 1786 in New York, in a pattern that would repeat itself throughout her life, John's career decisions altered hers. He was hired as the editor for the Philadelphia Columbia magazine, and they moved to Philadelphia in early 1787, where a convention was to meet to revise the federal Constitution. Philadelphia was diverse and cosmopolitan, the largest city in the United States with approximately 40,000 people, and reform was in the air. The Reverend Absalom Jones and the formerly enslaved Richard Allen formed that year the Free African Society to support the black population. The Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery reorganized under a new constitution prominently published in the paper. And reform interested the remarkable group of elite Philadelphia women. For example, Sarah Franklin Bache, leader of the Ladies Association of Philadelphia, a prominent philanthropic association. Eliza Willing Powell, the woman who asked Franklin about the type of government and was told, a republic if you could keep it. And the same woman who would urge George Washington not to resign after his first term. And Anne Willing Bingham, who would write about politics that summer to Thomas Jefferson. As the Constitutional Convention delegates gathered in 1787, Eliza Harriot gave what I currently believe to be the first public lecture by a woman in the United States. And she gave this remarkable first here at this institution, the one that would become the University of Pennsylvania. Beginning Monday, April 2nd, 1787, in every Philadelphia newspaper, Eliza Harriot's ads appeared for a course of lectures at the university. She gave her lectures in University Hall, which was then at 4th and Arch. It was the location of many male lectures, including recently Princeton's own Dr. Samuel Smith for the American Philosophical Society. And this was during the period when the College of Philadelphia had actually become the University of the state of Pennsylvania before the trustees reasserted control. And so the hall was in that moment, in some ways, a public state-sponsored space. Her lectures promoted Enlightenment belles lettres rhetoric, considered the foundation for professions like politics. And she gave at least 5 lectures in April, May, and June. She included classics like Milton, Shakespeare, and Pope, political reformers like James Thompson, Edward Young, William Shenstone, and the influential lawyer and Orientalist William Jones. She always included a woman author, the work of Madame de Genlis, the first woman to teach the French royal children, and she often included women as subjects, for example, in Xenophon's story of General Cyrus. As the first convention delegates began to arrive, a newspaper column, likely written by Eliza Harriot, praised the lady lecturer and her effort to cultivate and adorn, as she put it, the human mind. She was an example that in this country, the ladies are found in the society of the sages of the other sex and would command the honors due to the professors of science. Soon, Eliza Harriot predicted, the toilette and the drawing room, the 2 traditional venues for women, would be deserted for the forum and the college. Eliza Harriot's lectures were designed to encourage women to enter college education and the forum politics. Indeed, she delivered part of the prayer on Demosthenes from the Oration of the Crown, the most famous political speech. All told, there are over 140 ads or commentaries about her in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And Washington's presence at her May 18th lecture led to accounts of her lecture to be reprinted across the United States. Her lecturing, Washington's presence, and the convention were bound together. Now, in early June of 1787, she revealed an even more ambitious plan, a female Academy of Belles Lettres. It would have a governing board, half women, half men, run by majority rule with a female governor, which meant the women could always outvote the men. A woman was to always lead it, who would regularly publicly lecture to 300 people. Eliza Harriot explained, the exertions of a female should be an example to be imitated and improved on. She wanted to be an example, but not the exceptional example that men had often perversely used to show most other women's inferiority. But she wanted to be an example that would be emulated and improved on by future women. She sent her plan to Benjamin Franklin's daughter, and she may have inspired Anne Bingham's letter to Thomas Jefferson in June, which praised the education of French women and their happy variety of genius. Anne Bingham wrote to Jefferson that these women should be admired as the friends of the liberty of mankind reverence the successful struggles of the American patriots. Jefferson wrote back condescendingly that ladies should not, as he put it, wrinkle their foreheads with politics, but rather soothe and calm the minds of their husbands, returning ruffled from political debate. Jefferson was no feminist, need we say. Now, I believe this example of Eliza Harriot giving lectures, proposing a female Belles Lettres Academy, predicting that American women could join the college and the forum, influenced the Constitution's stylistic phrasing of offices. In state constitutions during this period, we find political participants described three ways, sometimes using neutral terms, like person or inhabitant, sometimes using generic terms in the 18th century language like he, and a very small number using gender-specific terms like male. The first draft of the Constitution actually included gender-specific language. Congress was described as two separate and distinct bodies of men. The pernicious 3/5 clause explicitly referenced inhabitants of every sex. And the draft fugitive slave clause used the phrase he or she. It's a testament to Black women's agency. One thinks of Oni Judge, who will soon thereafter escape from the Washingtons, that the Southern delegate who proposed the language of the fugitive slave clause could not think about fugitives without bringing explicitly to mind women. The final drafting committee, however, removed every gendered reference. And these changes created a neutral constitution with a person he pattern. Persons referred to inhabitants of every sex, and he clearly became a generic pronoun. We know this has to be interpreted this way because of the interstate rendition clause. Otherwise, women who commit treason, felony, and other crimes and flee across state lines do not have to be returned. Never once did the word male appear. And so the text of the Constitution left open and unanswered what would be the relationship of women to the constitutional state. It left itself curiously open to the possibility of female genius. But for others, female genius proved threatening. So enter Benjamin Rush. He had a remarkable, capacious mind. He was anti-slavery. He was involved in all sorts of reformist enterprises. He'd married Julia Stockton when she was 17, and they'd had 13 children. And at the time of Eliza Harriot's lectures, Rush served on the all-male board of a newly reorganized female school, the Young Ladies Academy. The men wanted to reform female education as long as they were in charge. In late July, Threatened by Eliza Harriot's new school advertisements, Rush gave a widely reprinted speech, Thoughts Upon Female Education. It was designed to destroy Eliza Harriot's plan. Rush gave the old female inferiority idea a new American twist, what historians came to call Republican motherhood. Gentlemen should direct female education. British ideas were un-American. French should not be taught. Women should be educated simply to be an agreeable companion for a sensible man, or the daughter or wife of an American citizen. And in thinking about what that meant, directed to Eliza Harriot O'Connor, married to an Irish Catholic immigrant with her own accent, one can hear the nativist strand. At Rush's Young Ladies' Academies, the girls' notebooks reminded of them of this limited ambition on the covers. And you can see the Young Ladies' Academy quote there, that the end of a good education is not that they should be dancers, singers, players, or painters. Eliza Harriot stood no chance. Rush's opposition doomed Eliza Harriot's plan for an academy, and she moved first to Baltimore, where she offered lectures on the compass of the human mind. Her tickets were sold by Mary Catherine Goddard, who was the first person to print the Declaration of Independence with the signer's name, and in so doing, then added her own at the very bottom. And then she moved on to Alexandria, where she started a female school, which Washington supported. And when her husband moved to Edenton, she got herself invited to Mount Vernon to spend 5 days with George and Martha Washington, consulting on her future plans. She eventually moved to Charleston in 1790 to found a female French and English academy. And perhaps because of connections made when her father briefly served there, and undoubtedly because of the socio and economic advantage of whiteness in a city built on slavery, Charleston was very successful for Eliza Harriot, and her school flourished. The curriculum included science, astronomy, and geography, and she may have crossed paths again with Washington when he came to town on his southern tour. Now, Eliza Harriot was not alone in her view that women were equal to men and that education, oratory, and political participation were linked. Female education was political. It proved that women were equal to men. And we can see this linking in the publications of the far more famous Mary Wollstonecraft. In 1787, the year that Eliza Harriot proposed her female Belles Lettres Academy, Wollstonecraft published Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. Several years later, the constitutional historian Catherine Macaulay similarly published a book emphasizing female education and female equality. Female education emphasized oratory and the power of learning to speak aloud. And in 1789, Wollstonecraft published The Female Reader under a pseudonym. It was designed to give selections to young women to learn to read out loud. The art of reading became a device to allow young women to invade public spaces with their voices. And then, in January 1792, Wollstonecraft published The Rights of Woman. It was initially positively received in the United States. The illustration you see here is in volume 1 of the Philadelphia Ladies Magazine, a new magazine. And it shows the genius of the magazine as a woman and the genius of emulation as a woman, presenting liberty with the rights of woman. Wollstonecraft lamented that women of a superior caste have not a road open by which they can pursue more extensive plans of usefulness and independence. Eliza Harriot could not have said it better. And then Wollstonecraft wrote, "I may excite laughter by dropping a hint, which I mean to pursue some future time. For I really think women ought to have representatives, instead of being arbitrarily governed without having any share allowed them in the deliberation of government. And so we can see now that exclusion was a custom, unjust and detrimental. These words appear in 1790 in a widely reprinted newspaper comment. Exclusion was a custom. It was not a legally required constitutional bar. Women, wrote the commentator, should not be obliged to submit to laws they had no share of making. It was unjust and detrimental. Women were equal to the males. And indeed, the custom of exclusion did not exist everywhere. Women and people of color voted in New Jersey in this period under a 1776 state constitution that stated all inhabitants could vote if they were worth 50 pounds. In 1790, New Jersey legislation explicitly used he or she to describe who was eligible to vote. And 7 years later, another law referred to his or her ballot. Extant poll lists, such as the one you see here, show many women voters. And indeed, a critic in the early 1800s complained that 10,000 women had voted. Back in Philadelphia in 1793, at the Young Ladies' Academy, a new young graduate, Priscilla Mason, who was old enough to have heard Eliza Harriot, 6 years older, gave a speech which has become a famous primary source document in many secondary education American history curriculums. Mason protested the limits on women. Supposing now we possessed all the talents of the orator in the highest perfection, where shall we find a theater for the display of them? The church, the bar, the Senate are shut against us. Who shut them? Man, despotic man, first made us incapable of the duty and then forbid us the exercise. Let us by suitable education qualify ourselves for those high departments they will open before us. The trajectory was clear. Education, oratory, and the doors of the Senate and the bar would open. But this vision and Eliza Harriot's collapsed. In the spring of 1792, a large financial crisis rocked the United States. In Charleston, Eliza Harriot's husband found himself caught in this financial crisis, and he brought her down with him. She published an ad to excuse the interruption in her business inevitably produced by the disorder in Mr. O'Connor's pecuniary engagements. And they left town, fleeing across state lines to flee debts. And so too, the vision promoted by Eliza Harriot, Wollstonecraft, Macaulay, and others collapsed after 1792. There's a variety of explanations, but they result in what historian Rosie Zagari has called a backlash against women's inclusion in the constitutional state. And you see here a very famous advertisement of it, where Wollstonecraft's very famous picture is reconfigured with her looking very masculine. They took it and they sort of suggested in a totally different way of portraying her. Importantly, the new genre of the written Constitution converted custom to very sticky constitutional law. As new states entered the Union, voter requirements shifted. In 1792, Kentucky broadened suffrage for white men. It became the first Western state to permit men to vote without property or tax-paying requirements. But it did so by describing voters as free male citizens. The language resembled the recent Federal Militia Act of 1792, which stated that every free, able-bodied white male citizen was to enroll, and which drew on some Southern constitutions. By 1799, indeed, Kentucky had excluded free people of color from voting or bearing arms. And by 1802, the Kentucky model proved dominant. Every state admitted to the Union between 1802 and 1876 defined suffrage by constitutional exclusion. These laws began with an adjective, free or white, and after 1820, almost always white. It ended with a description, person, inhabitant, citizen. But what never varied was the new inclusion of the word male. Indeed, in 1807, New Jersey reversed course and passed a new law limiting voting to free white male citizens. By the 19th century, greater participation in government had occurred. By 1840, in theory, political historians believe more than 90% of white men could, in theory, vote, but at a great cost. Like people of color, women found themselves constitutionally excluded because they were not white males. What historians used to call the rise of democracy in the 1820s is actually something that doesn't look very much like democracy. Eliza Harriot's own life followed this decline. In 1793, she moved to Columbia, where she started a female seminary devoted to, as she put it, improving the female mind. John vanishes completely. She maintained her ambition. This is the last ad I found from her in 1799. And in it, she describes her teaching as a feeble attempt, but she nonetheless goes on to propose an evening school to teach French. When she died in 1811, she was a boarder in someone else's house. And yet still, one can hear her ambition. She tried to exert control over her property, writing a will, signing her name. And her inventory recorded her books, her spectacles, and her sewing materials. I could find no gravestone for her. Now, what influence did she have? We don't know precisely, but recall Eliza Harriot's words. The exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved on by future candidates for fame. And if we look carefully, we see examples following the path that Eliza Harriot tried to open, each imitated and improved on by another woman. So take women's rights activists, like the Philadelphia Fortin sisters. They were educated, sometimes at female academies. They grew comfortable as public lecturers. They often tried teaching. For them, female education and the vote was bound together. Indeed, the first woman to vote under unrestricted suffrage was Utah school teacher Seraph Young in 1870. And the first black woman to register to vote in 1871 was Mary Ann Shadd Cary, the African-American teacher and later lawyer. So return for a moment to Columbia, the place where Eliza Harriot died. In 1869, after the Civil War, the reconstituted South Carolina legislature invited any lady to give a speech arguing for women's rights to vote. Only one lady accepted, Charlotte Rollin. Charlotte Rollin was a South Carolina-born black woman, educated much like Eliza Harriot, fluent in French and belles letters. And her speech argued for black women and all women to claim the franchise. She argued it was a fundamental and constitutional right belonging to humanity in general. The New York Times noticed her argument and mocked it. They said her argument was, the Constitution did not include the word male. Sex was unknown to the Constitution, and therefore women had a right to vote. Now, Arlin managed to get her speech printed, and at least 4 copies survive today. She was overlooked largely by the very famous compilation that Susan B. Anthony and Stanton did of the women's rights movement. But Arlin continued to work with women's suffrage associations, arguing for the right of representation. In May 1787, George Washington heard Eliza Harriot deliver a lecture on the power of eloquence, on the power of being an example. In the 1780s, the age of the Constitution rearranged assumptions about who constituted the state, and female genius became a rebuttal. And the Constitution, importantly, was stylistically framed consistent with female genius. But Eliza Harriot's example also inspired opposition. And in the 1790s, as female genius turned into the rights of woman, opposition grew. And it took the new constitutional state and it converted it to one defined by exclusion. But who knows what ripples went forth from her lectures, her schools, and her many newspaper ads. As an early example of the path from female education towards the college and the forum, her performance was certainly more than tolerable. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Are you willing to entertain some questions?
To answer questions.
All right. Anybody? Any questions?
And you can buy the book. And moreover, you can now listen to the book because it's on Audible.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Wow. In our business, very few books get read by, but it's on Audible.
Can you tell us how you came across Eliza Harriot?
Eliza Harriot? Yeah, I wrote another book in which there's no women, only men, and mostly one man, James Madison, the book that you referred to, Madison's Hand. And in reading that book, I read every account of the summer of 1787, including George Washington's journal. And George Washington kept a journal when he was in Philadelphia, but he only wrote about what he did outside the room. And it's actually pretty interesting. He went to see all the big houses. He had tea most of the time with women. He rode his horse. And he recounts going out with Mary White Morris and a group of ladies to hear Eliza Harriot's lecture. And at the time, I was like, that's interesting, weird. I wonder if that's normal. Like, were other women lecturing? Didn't think so, but. And then so when I finished that book, I was like, I'll go back and see if there's anything there. And I was actually super discouraged about the project because when you start a project and you realize there's only 5 letters and 4 of them involve her like, can I come to Mount Vernon? Thank you for inviting me to Mount Vernon. I don't have a carriage, so I'd love to accept. Washington she actually says like, you have to send the carriage if you want me to come. And so Washington sends the carriage for her. I didn't think there was an awful lot there. And then I started to look for her in newspapers. And that's when the project really opened up because I was able to find over 300 newspaper ads that she placed or comments about her. And so it's, in some ways, it's really a project born out of that.
Right. We have a question back here.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating. I wondered about another Eliza that was significant in Washington's life, and about Eliza's Powell.
Yeah.
What's her name? Can you talk about, do you know if they had any interaction?
Yeah, I would think that she ran in the same circles with Eliza Powell. Eliza Powell was a very famous woman in Philadelphia, came from a very illustrious Philadelphia family, the Willings, and was close companion, shall we say, to George Washington that summer. Martha had stayed at Mount Vernon, and they spent a lot of time together. There's a very cute letter. I mean, I don't think you should probably say cute about George Washington, but it is kind of cute. He's like, I'll pick you up in the carriage. We'll go to the play together. Okay, so they actually had a lot of fun together. Not implying anything salacious, but they had a good time. And she regretted her own lack of education. She actually has a very poignant letter where she writes about how she wishes that she could have been educated and that women's education was open to her. So I think she would have been sympathetic to that part. Eliza Harriot actually, when she started opening ads for schools, would always include a notice that older women could come to the lectures every week, women who hadn't actually had the opportunity to have an education during their young lifetime. So she cared about that. Benjamin Rush, however, this is the alternative piece, when Benjamin Rush publishes thoughts on the education of daughters, he dedicates it to Eliza Powell. So whether he was like, with your consent, I dedicate it to you, or whether it wasn't with her consent, I don't know. She's become very interesting to a lot of historians because unlike Eliza Harriot, she has very extensive papers, particularly papers showing her financial acumen and sort of dealing with the financial side. And she's the woman who Washington wanted to resign and after his first term, and she wrote him a letter saying, you can't resign, and a lot of people credit her with not resigning. And then, much to my annoyance, she is also the woman who people say a lady came up to Ben Franklin, and then they quote, a republic if you can keep it, and they never give her name. And that's Eliza Powell, so that's it. But yeah, it's an excellent question.
Great. We have another question right here, but I think you're supposed to press down the button for your microphone for the people joining on Zoom. It makes it much more audible.
Yes, and this is not a question, but I was about to say that about the button, which I'm doing here, and also for those who are in for CLE, either in the room or on Zoom. The second password is genius. Okay, so genius is the word. Thank you.
Please proceed.
Okay, my name is Jenny Reese. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of History here, and I'm currently a TA for our American Revolution class, and I just gave a guest lecture on your book, and so I just wanted to say, thank you so much. The book is amazing, and I mean, I hope I have a student here sitting next to me that I conveyed your book correctly, and I think the students really enjoyed it. And so my question for you is sort of about pedagogy. So how do you, how do you think this changes how we teach this period? And two, I guess also, how do you think this, and it's related, I guess, how do you think this reflects on how we teach about Republican motherhood? Yeah.
Yeah, great question, and thank you so much. And I'm sure you probably did a better job explaining my book than I did, because I always get this moment where I'm so embarrassed, and I'm like, who really wants to hear about my book? So it's, thank you very much for that. So this is, I teach constitutional history. I spend a lot of time talking about constitutional history. I'm perfectly happy to spend some time geeking out about inside the convention. But I think that's not the way we should teach this period. I think we spend way too much time teaching this period without emphasizing the way in which it was a space and a generation, and there were all sorts of voices and people who were participating in debates and reform, and not just ratification of the convention, but putting pressure on literally the convention itself. And that's why I use this framing generation concept, because I think it allows us to authentically open up the lens of how we imagine this period. And I think the biggest mistake that's been made in a funny way is instead of thinking harder about what those kinds of public portrayals do, we sort of accept them. And there's a way in which sometimes politically it's a useful pushing off point to remind people who's not in the room. But I think it's really important to restore the voices outside the room. And there are lots of those voices. And one of the exercises that I do with my class is everybody picks, now you can get newspapers very easily, you know, all major universities have access to newspapers, and everybody goes out and selects a newspaper from the summer of 1787, just one day, and they read it, and then we all come back together and talk about what did it feel like was going on in the world at that moment. And one of the things that becomes very obvious is that people in Pennsylvania, it's like a little tiny part of a very big world. And there's so much international news, there's so much news about other developments, there's news about all sorts of people, and then we sort of try and place it back in that. And I'm just really committed to this. There's several new projects that are trying to rethink sort of classically events that we have tended to think of as white male events through a lens of a spatial inclusion. Who else is in the story that we can see? And I think newspapers really provide that. As for Republican motherhood, Republican motherhood is this idea that very much comes out of two really fabulous books, one written by Linda Kerber and the other written by Mary Beth Norton, very famous women's historians. And they talked about, well, how could we think about women in this period? And they, because of the prominence of Rush's speeches and because of some other materials, they really heard women, particularly women in the domestic sphere, claiming a role for themselves in raising American husbands. And that became kind of turned into a cartoon version over time in which that was the only thing that existed, Republican motherhood. And if you go back and read Mary Beth and Linda's books, that's not actually what they argued to begin with, so it's a kind of cartoon version. I was super relieved they both liked my book, so I was like, phew, okay, phew. But I think more importantly, it raises the ways in which we often teach moments of history as if there's only one idea. And one of the things the book says, and really I think, is we know in our own time that there are ways in which one voice feels very loud and very dominant, and yet there's all sorts of other people living their lives to make a different reality. And I think one of the problems with the pressure of the big history class pedagogy is we only tend to follow one voice. And one of the things I like very much about some of the secondary school curriculums now is that they think about multiple voices and debates and things like that. And so in some ways that's what I really like here, because you can actually show Rush is responding to her. And so we restore her voice, which we've been missing, because Rush's voice as a white man, he controlled the press, he had such power, and I think there's other voices we can do this to, but a great question.
Thank you, Jane. There was another question sort of close. No? Serena, I think I'll come to you.
You're probably tired of questions from me at this point.
I'm not. Serena gave a wonderful comment at the American Society of Legal History on my book and a wonderful biography of Constance Baker Motley.
I was curious in thinking about sort of your overall body of work, which is wonderful and amazing. If this project caused you to think differently about anything that you'd written previously, either methodologically or substantively?
So, the very first book I wrote had a whole chapter on women, and thinking about how women appear in lawsuits in a world where they can't sue in their own names, and really how do we hear them in law where they can't sue in their own names. And I think now I'd probably write that in a louder voice than I did. I wrote that in a kind of quiet voice. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's like hard, I don't know. Maybe I don't want to go back and reflect on my past life. But a lot of this, I think one thing that happens, in part because of, this is why I think it really matters who's in a classroom. If you teach constitutional history, you want to teach constitutional history in ways that resonate with people in the classroom, that resonate with your own story. And I have to say, at a certain point, I got tired of showing up at things like the wonderful National Constitution Center and other places, and it being a whole bunch of white men and me. And there's a way in which those kinds of moments make you think back on, well, like, how does one take that feeling and then think about how maybe the ways in which we've done history contribute to how we understand that feeling. But yeah, it's a really good question. I feel like I would know it better if I had a stronger sense of where I'm going from here. But yeah, it's a great question. Now I'll be worried, like, what should I have done differently?
Yes, please, sir.
I understand, especially during
You have to hold it, sorry.
I understand, especially the early colonial period, there were a lot of ways for women to negotiate their positions in society because it was a frontier society. There was a lot more opportunities for them to get involved. So is that still the case during this point? I know there's a lot of urbanization going on, especially along the coast, but would you say women in America at this time were freer than women in Europe, their European counterparts?
Yeah, I mean, such a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that, and I think people would have very different answers. I think just speaking about her own life with this book, one thing, there's a couple things that really matter for her, probably. One, and this is true a little bit in the United States, but probably less so in England. In England, in the class that she comes from, the idea that your father leaves you money that your husband can't touch is a not uncommon thing, so the separate trust. And for her, that probably provided some source of income. And similarly, I think she published 2 books, and there's just a huge sort of culture in England at this point about women writing, which hasn't yet really taken hold in the United States. So I think there's ways in which those things are different. What's really remarkable about her experience is you can see the ways in which other women who were working or had ambition tried to help her. And so in a lot of the places that she goes, you can connect her ad or the location of her school to another woman. And that's the glimpse you have of at least women trying to mediate lives. And I think newspapers really allow us to do a lot more with this, because we've tended to think women don't publish in this period. But if you look at newspaper ads, actually, there's a lot of publication by women. So partly we just do the genre a little bit differently. But a wonderful question. Thanks.
Professor Brown.
Do you hold it down? Okay, sorry, just a little technical glitch. Can you hear me? So thank you for this wonderful talk. When you said that Eliza Harriot is probably the first woman to have given a public lecture, that really just kind of rocked my world in a very good and interesting way.
I was going to say, hopefully not, because you know of another one.
No, well, I've been racking my brain, and I think, I'm going to think more about that, but I think you're probably right. My question is about how she manages to get to speak at College Hall. You kind of suggest that it's because of the state funding of the university at that point, but I feel like there has to be a story there. And I'm wondering if there's a kind of Quakerly influence where women in speaking roles is perhaps making it a little easier for her to do this in Philadelphia. But I just wonder, I know you're working with little shards of evidence. Is there anything else you can think of, or could you just speculate? How does she manage to get to do that? Because I think the state funding wouldn't explain it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's so much that it's state funded, but for me, it's sort of interesting that it's at the moment when it's technically not a private institution. So she probably gets the idea for lectures from Noah Webster, who she probably had seen in New York. Noah Webster actually sees her and records her in the diary. And Webster had lectured and been panned in Philadelphia. He was like a really bad lecturer. He also criticized what older women wore, and that didn't go over well with the audience. And the College Hall was actually used by a lot of people, so they had concerts and things like that. So it's a fascinating question of like, who helped her? Because she's able to sort of, her first ad doesn't say at the university, but basically very shortly thereafter, she's at the university. And so somebody in a position of power got her in there, and I would just love to know who that is, and I don't know who it is, whether it's, there is this one letter to Sally Franklin Bache, and so whether it's someone like that, whether it's the Morrises, yeah. There's one venue left extant that she spoke in, and that's in Charleston, South Carolina. One of the long rooms that she spoke in was there. And when my family, we went down to Charleston, and then I was like, excuse me, can we go to this place? And they let me up to see it. It's now been partially restored. And even that place, which wasn't nearly as big as the hall on 4th and Arch, is just an enormous, it's a pretty big space. And, I think this is where you have to imagine like the Hollywood movie version of the radicalness of a crowd of men, a mixed audience, listening to a woman speaking. And I tried to look to see if there were depictions of women speaking, and the only women speaking you get depictions of in this period are actresses, and interestingly, most of them have their mouths closed. So the most famous example, a portrayal of a woman speaking, is the sort of Hortensia arguing to the Roman Senate. But it's not clear that was even well known as an image. So she's really quite, she's honestly almost like a little bit crazy in doing this. It's also part of an entrepreneurial thing because she gets the lecture money and then she's got an income and she can turn that around and do a school. But yeah, if you ever have a student, send them off. Maybe somewhere inside the University of Pennsylvania records, there's like rented hall for X amount of money, which would be great, just great to know.
Great question. And I have to say, I've read a lot about how many terrible lectures there were. They were really long, 3-hour, boring, right. So I'm afraid that's our final question. I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to ask Dean Ruger to come.
Sure, I'll press the button here. It's not necessarily the final question. It's an invitation for all of you to join us literally right outside the doors for a reception. We have, I think, some food and refreshments, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Bilder. Yes. Thank you. Truly, another form of genius we saw, and I would say, with appreciation of Nessa Adams and the support of the lecture, this relates a little to your response to Professor Brown. I do think Penn was probably in it for some profit motive themselves. I noticed that they sold, this was the custom back then, they sold tickets, and you could get them at the City Tavern, 3 women or 1 man and 2 women. So they were looking to fill a hall. I'd actually love to research how that contracted. We'll look in our archives. I doubt it's there, but we can all of us who enjoyed this without having to buy a ticket, we can thank Nessa Adams for supporting this. Thank you.